Yokoso Otakus, today we're going to be talking about the Mushoku Tensei Light Novel 1. And before we go into it, I'm kind of going to explain a little bit about why I'm getting into this and how this video is going to play out. So some of that is going to involve me looking at my phone a little bit, so you'll just have to forgive me. There's like 7 pages of notes I have on this. I used to be a really big anti-Isekai guy. I never liked any of them. I had a lot of people gave me tons of suggestions of tons of different ones to watch. Konosuba, ReZero, Shield Hero, Log Horizon. It just seemed like no matter what one I watched, I never really found one that resonated with me. But I kept hearing over and over again about the granddaddy of all isekai. Everybody said, you gotta watch Mushoku Tensei. When I watched it for the first time, I was in love with it. I didn't think I could ever like an anime like that in the modern era. I definitely never thought it would be an isekai that I would like so dang much. But there I was, me and my girlfriend, watching this show for the very first time, just infatuated with it. I love the story. I love the characters. There was really very little about this that I loved. And a big part of it was because this was a much more adult and well-told story and character development than many, many things I've seen in so many animes. Because I loved it so much, I went and I decided I'm gonna make the biggest video of my entire YouTube career. And I took all this money that people had donated and had paid in for memberships and stuff on the channel, and I went out and I hired an editor, a really good editor that cost me a huge amount of money. And I wrote a script, and I spent longer than I've ever done writing a script before to make this video. And I was just really excited to get it out. I made this banger thumbnail, which I'm probably gonna reuse for this video. And I put this video out into the ethos, and the response to it was insane. I never in my life have had a video explode so massively. There was tons of comments, there was tons of people chattering and talking about it, and I was blown away. And I thought to myself, wow, I can't believe so many other people are so in love with this. The video shockingly reached like 10,000 views in just a matter of hours during the day, which is astronomical given my tiny channel size. I was on cloud 9 until I wasn't. Apparently, when you make anime videos, you can get copyright stricken to absolute oblivion. But even beyond that, there's Japanese watchdog legal groups that hunt people down for doing this kind of stuff, and I had one come after me for the video. I tried to re-edit it, I tried to fix it over and over again, and it was just banned everywhere. There was no way I could keep this video out, and so unfortunately, I had to scrap the entire video. On my way there, before it was scrapped, I got to read a lot of really beautiful comments from a lot of people. And one thing that I had a ton of people tell me that I really needed to do was I needed to read the light novel. And people wanted to see me do a reaction or a video or talk about it in some way. Now, this was years ago, and we're here now. So I finally started reading the light novel. Before we get into this, I'm gonna do a breakdown chapter by chapter, but I do have to let it be known that I have watched all the way through the most current episode of season 3 right now of the show. So I'm a lot farther ahead than I am in the light novels. I am on the 3rd light novel right now, and I'm absolutely loving them. So with that, I want to talk about the light novel and my thoughts and feelings on it and what I really like about it. And I hope you guys enjoy this. I made some really fun chapter markers that break down each chapter, and we're just going to go piece by piece through it. And I'll be looking at my phone a little bit. So the prologue for the light novel starts off with the main character. And if I recall right, they don't even totally give him a name, but he's an old dude, like my age old dude. And he's basically a hikikomori who's living in his parents' house. And he's a really gross dude. Like, they talk about him being really into lolly, and he's just sheltered. He doesn't do anything good for his parents or for his family. And he just rots away playing video games, reading manga, watching anime, typical stuff, which most of it isn't actually gross. But as a person, he is very much just rotting away in this house, letting the world pass him by. The reason why is because he is very deeply ruined emotionally. He had a normal life at one point. He went to school. He tried his best. He tried to be this good person, that fitting into society and stuff. And it didn't work out for him. As he got older, he ended up getting relentlessly teased and bullied. And it got to a horrible point where he was bullied to a point where he was like left with his penis exposed, basically, left out for everyone to see and take pictures of. And the whole event just really messed him up. And because of that, he ended up just sheltering himself in his house and rotting away for all of this time. So this part of the story kind of starts more where his parents have now died and his siblings are taking over the house. They don't want anything to do with him. They smash his stuff, they berate him, they tell him how horrible he is, and they say, "You're done, you're out of here, and you get nothing." And they throw him out on the streets. Well, he's out on the streets. Very shortly after, he goes to save some kids who are standing on the road, and Truck-kun gets him. A very big staple of Isekai. One that I think is kind of overplayed, but it was totally fine. And he's dead. He's gone and away. And that's where the prologue is for the story. I think that it's a very interesting tale that's being told. And in a lot of ways, this character isn't your favorite character of all time. I mean, they literally go to lengths of talking about how he's just jerking it off in his bedroom while his parents are at his funeral. And I think that in a person in 2026, there's a whole lot of ways you could look at that very negatively and be really disgusted about it. But my whole argument for just really this entire series is that you need to look at this from not a very juvenile lens. You need to be adult about this, and you need to look at much bigger and wider theming that this is presenting. This show isn't something that's quite as simple, and it has a lot of nuance to it versus many other shows. And the light novel really dives into that in really great ways. I still don't think that Rudius is the greatest character to always root for, but he is a really major character that I think is important and well written in the way that he's a very destitute and destroyed and hurt man who has spent the bulk of his life degenerating away in a room without building all these skills and living these lives that most people get to experience. And when he's given a chance at a new life, he's not going to do that perfectly. That's not real life. We all like to see heroes succeed and be great and wonderful people, but this person is completely marred by his past and struggles through many of the actions that he makes. And so he's a character that we get to root for when he makes great decisions, but also know that he's going to fall and stumble and he's going to make poor decisions. And those things are definitely not going to align with a lot of what our normal and modern views are now. But they are very real, and it's an incredible story with an incredible character developed. Chapter 1 starts off pretty basically, but it gives you the introduction to the world. You get to see Rudius as he's born, and he's, in his formative years during that time. I mean, very much like literally formative years. He's a tiny little baby, and he's trying to wrap his mind around what's happening in this world. And he gives a lot of thought to what's happened to me, where am I at, what's going on. And then he has like basically this 40-year-old mind that has to learn kind of how to be a baby again. But how realistic is that? Like, if you're grown to be 40, it's going to be hard. You're going to have all those thoughts and feelings and things that you've experienced. And so through just the little first part, you just get to see him doing his basic discovery of the world. And I think it's a really interesting take on it. I'm used to seeing other isekai where it seems like someone's like fully grown when they come to this new world or whatever. And it was just really refreshing to me to get this kind of input of this character literally being born again from the time of a baby. And, there's some funny comical stuff that happens with that too, because God damn, would that just be crazy to be freaking 40 years old and having to be sucking on mama's tits again? Like, I mean, it's fucking weird. It's weird, and it is what it is, but part of the story. So by the end of him kind of learning just these basics of what this world is, he actually ends up getting very, very excited. This was not an opportunity he ever thought he would have. This truly is an entire new chance at life, to live again, to do it better. And it just really sets the stage for a really powerful story that's going to continue to be told.
That's our maid, Lilia. I'm a big fan of her talents.
So chapter 2 is where we learn about Lilia, the maid. And she's also the caretaker, the person that helps raise Rudius through all this. And you get to hear a lot about her background, which I just found to be extremely interesting. If I remember right, she was like a handmaiden in like the high courts or something like that. And as part of that, not only did she have to know all the caretaking and rearing of children and stuff and maid and upkeep stuff, but she also had to be a badass warrior, which I don't remember being in the anime. It's been a long time since I've saw it, but I was actually really enthused to hear about that and thought it was really, really cool. And through her doing that, that's actually where she meets Paul for the first time, which is just very kind of briefly talked about. But one day, something kind of tragic happens where the person that she's looking after gets an assassination attempt on them, and they go to stab him with the spear, and Lilia gets hit by it. So she does her job at protecting, but there's a poison that generally would just kill a person immediately. And in this particular case, she doesn't end up getting killed because they're able to counteract the poison very quickly, based on them actually having a good idea that this poison was going to be able to be used. The problem is, though, is that she's now permanently disabled in a way where she can never be as quick as she was before. And so because of that, she doesn't have the ability to continue doing her job as great as she should. And so there's no place for her in the court anymore. They give her the opportunity to leave, which I remember her thinking is just so strange. She thinks that most of them, I guess, are killed. I think that's the standard for them. And so because of that, she doesn't really want to like hang around when they let her go. And she like races off. She goes out and she finds this job out in a small town, away from everything, away from all the other kingdoms and stuff, somewhere that she can kind of lay low for the moment and help raise Paul's child, essentially. When she gets to become the housemaid at Paul and Zenith's house, she's raising Rudius, and she immediately, as a person who's raised other children before, sees Rudius as being very weird and very odd, to the point where she is actually very thoroughly creeped out. And I think that's really rightfully so, because, again, Rudius is fresh to this world, as previously been a 40-year-old man, and he's strange. He's very strange. He does not do anything that normal kids do. But it's also really interesting because Paul and Zenith are also very young, and they have this child young. It's their first child they've ever had. They don't even know what to expect. And so it's almost kind of beautiful in that way for Rudius, because they don't really get that he's weird and strange and bizarre, because there's no reference that they have. They've been young adventurers, basically, for a period of time. We'll get more into their backgrounds later. Anyway, what I really liked about chapter 2 was a lot of it is just from Lilia's perspective. And it's just really cool to kind of get an idea about the show and what's going on from someone else's perspective other than Rudius, as most stuff from what I remember in the anime, it's really specific to Rudius and his feelings and his experiences. And the light novel really allows for a lot more of expansion into the deeper nuances of how he's interacting and, affecting all the people around him.
Hard to wrap my brain around, since I used to have almost 1,000. They were all light novels, but still.
That's no good.
So chapter 3 is a textbook of magic, and this is basically where Rudius is now 2 years old at this time. It's actually kind of crazy to think about a lot of this, but again, he's framed from the mind of a 40-year-old man. He starts delving into the books of the world. He wants to learn about everything. He wants to learn about the language, the writing, but then he finds a book of magic. And that's where things get really fun for him. He spends a lot of time up in the top floor of the house poring over this book, where he's reading it over and over. He's trying to figure this out and see. He's wondering himself, can I do magic? Which I just thought was really cool, because I feel like I literally would be the same way. I mean, anyone would. Like, magic is not something that's available in our real world or anything that we get to experience outside of fantasy media. And to be placed into a situation where we could also learn that, I think I too would just be delving just straight into it and getting right into it. The weird part is that he's 2, but it seems like he kind of gets to hide away in this room, and nobody really sees him a whole lot. It is mentioned at some point that Lilia kind of gets this idea of it, but I think most people are just like, he's a 2-year-old and he's looking at books. They look funny and there's pictures and stuff. So nobody really plays a lot with it, but it is a very, very interesting chapter as it just dives into the basics of magic and how this works. And honestly, it's a pretty complex system that you continue to learn about as the books go through. And it's just a really kind of enjoyable little exploration, kind of pushing a little bit further with the world building of everything. And I really enjoyed the details on this one. One of the other things I wanted to mention about this chapter is we also kind of get to start to see some of the more positive aspects of Rudius in his prior life. Like, while he was very gross and disgusting and very degenerate in a lot of ways on the outside, there was also a lot of other little skills and points of interest about himself that were very good. Like, he was incredibly skilled with video games, and he obviously had a lot of different deep thinking about games and strategies and the way things work, in those worlds. And this, while he's learning about magic, those things go hand in hand with him kind of developing this talent and this craft, which is just really good writing, really.
Repeat after me.
Do you have to say the incantation?
Yeah, how else are you gonna cast?
Confirmed. I'm a badass.
Chapter 4 is like just a super long chapter. The one thing about this light novel is the chapters are kind of all over the place in length. Some of them are incredibly short, and some of them are wildly long. In chapter 4, we see that Rudy is now 3 years old. And it starts off basically while he's training, in secret. He ends up actually using magic, and not just a little bit of water magic, but a huge amount of water magic. And he blows this giant hole right through the side of the house, essentially. So there's no covering it up. And everyone now knows that not only is he able to do magic, but he seems to be pretty talented or having a natural affinity for it, which is just an absolute shock at 3. Like, I could not imagine that. I raised a child myself, and I could not imagine my 3-year-old having anything even near that skill. Like, around that time, she was instead just punching turtles and learning about her real basic good and bad. Rudy's parents, however, respond in a very interesting and unique way. They're very excited. They're just showing how incredibly naive they are, not even being blown away that a child that young can do such amazing things. Instead, they're just to the moon, and they're like, oh my God, we got to get him enrolled in training, and our son's a genius, and all this other stuff, which is very, very interesting. But again, it's just this building block of how young and naive both Paul and Zenith are. But with that excitement, we get an introduction to one of Rudy's first love interests, Roxy, who is a magician who is brought in to teach him about the ways of magic. And when Roxy shows up, she's very short, she's very small statured, she is very young looking in many physical ways. However, she is demon, so she is much older than she is, and she has an incredible wealth of magic experience to teach Rudius. Rudius, though, being the horn dog he is, he's just kind of emphatically all over her, and he flirts with her, and he's trying to watch her in different moments of herself and stuff like that. And she herself is kind of more on the emotional level at this time, I think, is like a very young, I would say maybe around 12 or 13. It's kind of hard to gauge, but there's a huge age difference. That is for certain. But I think on an emotional level, the two might actually be kind of similar. Because again, you have to realize that while this guy is 40, he's incredibly emotionally stunted. He's had very little interaction with people beyond just a very low juvenile grade. And he just becomes kind of infatuated with her. Roxy, for some reason, finds it kind of charming. So there's a little bit of back and forth, and their situation gets kind of interesting. But the bigger part of it is that she's teaching him magic and that he gets to move forward with his learning. He gets to increase his abilities with magic, which he does extremely fast. And we do get to learn a little bit about Roxy. She's kind of a little ditzy in some ways. You know, she blows up Zenith's tree and has to repair it really quick. And she's a klutz, I think is how they really describe it in the book and in the anime. So 4 months pass throughout his training, and he just races straight up to intermediate level, which you learn there's a number of tiers in the magic systems and in the sword systems. And intermediate is the next step beyond the basics, which is wildly impressive at his age, honestly. And Roxy is also really shocked and surprised by this as well. But along with him learning this magic stuff, I really love that Roxy also opens Rudius up to kind of the greater world of things. She starts teaching him about history, about the different continents that there are, about the different creatures and all sorts of different things in this world. And it gets really interesting, and it kind of makes the relationship between the two so much deeper than just like a teacher. Like she's more like a full mentor than she is a teacher, which Rudius later kind of leans into feeling like she's master. But the other thing that you learn about Roxy, and it's something that actually bugs me the most about her character, is she has a really, really strong feeling of being inadequate, of not being good enough, of not being talented. And this comes through so strongly. It is almost her entire character for most of what she does, despite the fact that she shows incredible talent and she does so much to kind of cultivate Rudius into growing as a man in many ways, but not exactly like most people when they use that sentence. It's just a lot of learning and growing and emotional development and shaping. And it's an experience, I think, that Rudius never had in his previous life. So he's just full into it. Like, not only does he have this new world that he gets to experience, but now he has this kind of person that is there to teach him and to direct him and to answer questions for him, make him feel safe and make him feel comfortable and really build him up as a person when the other 40 years of his life, he was just a wreck in shambles that, you know, people wanted to help and he wouldn't even let them provide any help to him. He was just, you know, proverbially a wreck. So as the story continues, one of the things that he learns about is actually a really major part of everything, and that's the great human-demon war that happened a bunch of years ago. So she teaches him about how there's this giant war and how the continents split up, and, you know, how there's the demon continent now, and then basically this other continent that they're on, and just about that stuff in the world, which is really big and plays a giant part in a lot of different things to come. I'm not going to get super deep into it right now. Rudius also grows up all the way to the age of 4 at this point, and he gets to an advanced level of magic, which is pretty outstanding. I think there's a lot of people like Paul, I think, is advanced level in his swordcraft, and he's like 25 at this point. So Rudius being 4 at an advanced level is absolutely bonkers. And the other thing, too, that I really want to say about these kind of formative chapters is I feel like they go through them very quickly, especially like when he's really young. He progresses in his life really quickly. And I think that the reason why that is, I can't say for sure because I'm not the author, but I think that the reason why they do that is just a lot of stuff doesn't make a ton of sense, and like the actual believability of it, I know it's fiction, just is so off kilter from like anything that like we know at all in our universe that we live in. The idea of like a 3-year-old shamelessly flirting with someone much older than them is weird. Also, you know, sitting down and and diving into the mechanics of magic and asking these like really hard-hitting and like interesting questions. Like these are things that the people in this world go about. And even like as a reader, it seems weird. Like I get that he's 40-year-old mentality and stuff like that, but it's weird in this world that those things are not called suspect and that more people aren't overly worried about it. Like I mentioned before, there's Lilia who sees some actions and she's kind of creeped out, weirded out, knowing how other children are. But a lot of other stuff is just kind of swept under the rug as like, well, Paul and Zenith have never raised a child before, but how would they know? But like, wouldn't they kind of know to a certain degree? It's very weird. And you think Roxy would call all sorts of stuff to question on how deep of some of these conversations are that she's having. So I think because at the beginning it's a little rough to kind of explain well and tell a good story with, a lot of this stuff just gets kind of just plowed through up until a certain point. And I think that was the right idea to have, honestly. So this chapter ends with Rudius basically finding out that Roxy has been going out after lessons and stuff into the town and helping all the villagers with different things that they need that she can help with magic. So it shows that she's kind of a helpful person and she's, able to kind of bring this good feeling of the town about her, which is pretty important and also will play a little role later. It finally ends with, Rudius getting really pushy about, I need to call you master, I need to call you master, and Roxy really just shirking it off because of her own self-doubt in herself. I mean, it's almost self-loathing at a certain point. It's a very interesting dynamic, and it's something that just made Roxy really interesting to me right away with.
From me. Your very own wand. I crafted it yesterday.
Chapter 5 is where Rudius has his first birthday, because in this world, there is only 3 birthdays I think that you have. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm pretty sure you have one on your 5th birthday, one on your 10th birthday, and one on your 15th birthday. And they're kind of a big occasion, and there's different things that are done for each of your birthdays. But in this particular case, the family is going to gather together and have a delicious giant meal, and they're going to provide gifts to Rudius. And so with that, we get Paul, who gives Rudius 2 different swords, one for training and one for fighting, I guess, metal one. And his mother, Zenith, gives him a book on botanical life because she knows that Rudius is interested in the world of learning, and he just seems to be really interested in books. In this world, books are not very common. They don't have printing presses and stuff like that at this time. So because of that, these books are very rare and highly coveted, and it is a big gift that she gives him so that he can learn a little bit more about the world, which I thought was a pretty nice gift. And then finally, what I consider to be the biggest gift is Roxy gives him his first wand. And so it's kind of this big momentous occasion where the master is now providing her student with a wand, and she's crafted it herself using her knowledge and expertise about it. And so it's in a lot of ways a very intimate and powerful gift to give someone, which Rudius is very, very excited about. Rudius also continues his training. He's doing magic training and he's also doing sword training with Paul. So Roxy's teaching him all this stuff about magic, and then I think it's in the afternoons or split days. I can't remember how they do it, but Paul teaches him sword fighting. And through that, Rudius learns about the 3 different styles of sword fighting. I think there's 3. I don't remember what they are, but he's learning them and kind of starts with that training. So in my personal opinion, I think that Rudius doesn't put his full effort into sword training. He uses a lot of excuses, and they may be valid excuses. I mean, one is that a lot of the sword fighting and hand-to-hand combat stuff requires physical strength, and he's very young. He's like literally just 5. He's prepubescent, so he doesn't have a lot of muscle mass, and a lot of his training and stuff is just mostly hand-eye, so the amount that he can progress is physically limited to that time, which I will give him. But I also think that he just kind of gives up a little too easy on it, and then with magic, he's just deep dove into it. But even then, it's very funny because in this chapter, you actually learn that Roxy kind of believes that Rudius is too into swords and doesn't really care much about magic. And then Paul feels, actually rightfully so, the opposite way, where he thinks Rudius is too into magic and he's not into swords. So it just kind of makes this really interesting kind of difference between the two and his interactions with each of them and what they're observing, from watching him do that.
In thy flood of destruction! Cumulonimbus!
So this next chapter is huge, in my opinion. It's one of my favorite chapters of this light novel, and it's called Reasons for Respect. I think in the anime, I was just so locked in on this. But it's at this moment that Rudius has risen to a point where Roxy believes he needs to have his final challenge. And in order to do this final challenge, he's going to be taken out of town very far away and have to cast an incredibly powerful skill, which I believe is called Cumulonimbus, if I said that right, which is basically just like a gigantic storm. And there's some rules about it or whatever. But even bigger than that, actually, is Rudius has only spent just a little bit of time outside of his house. Like up until this point, Rudius has been very sheltered inside of his home. His world is very, very small still. It is bigger than when he was hikikomori'd in his room, but it isn't like he's actively gone out and socialized and seen people. He's still basically quite a shut-in in this world. But that has to change because Roxy can't have him cast this magic in the backyard. This is huge magic. This could change how crops are growing in the area, and it could have devastating effects on the people. So she's got to take them far away. And so with that, you get to see this really powerful mental struggle that Rudius has to leave the house, like going outside of their property, going down the road, traveling away from things is something that he has basically never done. The last time he did it was the really brief stint right before he was killed. And before that, he just spent years and years and years of fear and worry about other people, how people perceive him, how they're going to act with him. And he's only very comfortable with this really small select group of people. So this was powerful. This was powerful. And Roxy is the main agent in him finding success with this. They get on the back of Paul's horse and they start going down the road and leaving the area. And it's powerful to read the racing thoughts with Rudius's head. And I think the racing thoughts are some of the most powerful words in the books that I've read so far. Rudius just really panics and has a lot of issues. They did a great job of it in the anime, and I felt like most things, the feeling is really there, but there's just something different about reading it and his panic. It's like you like feel it in your soul, and he's terrified. But Roxy gently guides him through. She doesn't know what he's going through, obviously, because nobody knows that he's basically from another world, but she knows he's scared and that he's worried, and she sees him now as this scared little boy, which is something that we just don't get from the great and powerful learning Rudius at this point. And she gently guides him, and as she's guiding him, they go through the town, and Rudius gets to see how people revere her for her magical ability. Because remember what I said before, Roxy was going out in the town, she was helping people. And so people feel great about her. They feel very favorable. They're very impressed. She's been a great presence. And Rudius also knows magic, so that could be him too. And people could like him. It starts to give him hope, gives him good feeling, and gives him comfort. And it's just such a powerful thing to read as this goes on. Then, of course, they go out into the field in the middle of nowhere to cast this magic, and you get another really big, powerful moment. This is huge for Rudius. This is the accumulation of everything he's learned, and he wants to impress his master, this person that he looks up to, this person that's been teaching him and guiding him, and he has a lot of pressure on him, but also a lot of excitement, and he's ready to do this. And so before Rudius has to do it, Roxy casts the spell beforehand, and It's this hilarious moment where lightning actually strikes down and it kills Paul's horse, basically. Like it hits his horse, and that's like his horse is his life. Like it's everything to him. And Rudius is like, whoa! Just totally freaking out. Roxy panics as well. She runs over to the horse and she starts casting healing magic, and thankfully she's able to revive the horse. After that, she takes the horse and she goes and she builds this mud hut around them to protect them so that they're safe during this. And she sets Rudius out, and Rudius goes and he builds all this stuff up. And there's kind of this rules that she has for this test where he's got to make a certain skill happen, and it has to last for so long, and it has to have all these different elements and stuff. But Rudius, because he's from this other world, and this is a big thing that you see, is he thinks outside of the box a lot, and he starts to apply some of the knowledge about weather systems and how, you know, atmospheric pressures and stuff work, and he uses that in tandem with his magical ability to create this awesome and great power. And he does so wildly successfully, like just blowing away, to the point that Roxy asks him about it. And when he kind of explains what he's done and how he's made that happen the way that he has, where it's now sustainable to last a really long time, she says, okay, we don't need to do it for the whole time limit. We're good here. You have passed. You are now a saint tier water magician. This is generally a great reason to celebrate and to be excited and happy, but there's another problem that comes with this, and you get this other major emotional beat in this chapter, which I just feel like it's just chock full of this. Roxy doesn't know any more magic that she can teach Rudius. And so with him ascending to this level, he's now equal to her. And a really major and tough part about that is that Roxy has basically spent her whole life accumulating this knowledge to do that. And now she's seen this little boy in just a couple years just jump right to it, almost like it was easy. And she already feels terrible about herself. She always feels inadequate and like she's not good enough for things, that she doesn't have skill or talent. And this smashes her right in the face very brutally. But also she doesn't have anything to teach him. This is the end of their mentorship. Of course, you know, she goes back to the house and Paul and Zenith are like, oh, this is so amazing. This is so great. I know you're finished teaching my son, but we've loved having you in the home. You're part of our family, just like, you know, any other member is. And we would just love for you to stay. Because of the way she feels, she decides that she needs to go out and she needs to improve herself. So she's going to leave. And with that, she leaves Rudius, and Rudius loses his master.
Red gems in their foreheads, so don't you dare go anywhere near them.
His forehead is smooth and white.
Chapter 7 is Friends, and now that Rudius has overcome his terrified scariness of leaving the house, he wishes to leave the house again. He gets his botanical book that his mother gave him, and he sets out. He sets out to go check out the woods and the little fields nearby that, you know, that he believes are safe from monsters and stuff. And so he gets to go out for the first time. And it's kind of an incredibly powerful moment at this point. And it's really cool to see him actually improve himself like this and make good steps forward to actually having a better life than he had before. Before he goes, he has to talk with his father. And his father basically has this whole thing on how he used to be a skirt chaser and all this stuff, like, duh. His father's kind of this big womanizer dude at this point. He's just a horn dog. He's a horn dog is basically what it really is. So with that, he tells Rudius, you know, you go out, you get a girl, son. You go do that. Be a man. Be a gray rat. Rudius is like, well, sure, Dad. Why not? You know, and he sets out his little 5-year-old self, I guess. And he starts walking around. You know, he goes into the woods and the forest and stuff around there. And while he's headed out on this road, he sees this child being bullied. There's this group of kids, presumably from the nearby town, and they're just hucking these things of mud at this kid. And this kid is just in a corner basically, or curled up, just getting smashed by these mud balls and, you know, crying, probably whining, making, terrible sounds as they're just bullying. And the kids are yelling, demon, demon, demon at him. And Rudius, he's a just guy, and he decides, he's going to stop these kids. And so he starts creating these mud balls, and he hurls at them, and they are hurling mud balls back, and he's dodging them, and he kind of kicks the crap out of the kids in a way with these mud balls. And they run off, right? They go and they leave off. He's saved this person from the onslaught. So when he meets this kid, the very first thing he sees is this kid has green hair. And when Roxy was telling him about the different demons and the different races and stuff, she talks about this group called the Superb. And they have green hair, and they're basically like the boogeymen of everyone. They're like the people that the parents tell the children about. You got to run and hide and, stay away from them. They're evil, monstrous murderers that kill everyone. And so when he sees this green hair, he's kind of like, oh God, like, was this actually a terrible demon? But another trait about the Superb is they have jewels on the middle of their foreheads, and this child doesn't. So he expects, especially because they're being beaten up, that this child probably isn't that terrible, and he goes to console them. So this kid that he meets reveals himself to be called Sylph, and Rudius believes this child to be a beautiful little boy. We're going to get into something a little bit later, but honestly, from watching the anime, they did this really good job at this. So just heads up, Sylph is a female, but Rudius thinks that Sylph is just this beautiful boy, and he's glued on it. Now, when you watch the anime, it's undeniable, really, in most ways, that this is a female character. Like, Sylph looks feminine, and I don't think viewers were tricked by that at all. But Rudius is super confused, and in the anime, they handled it really well. I kind of wish I would have read the light novels first, because I feel like in the light novels, the reveal of it would be much more substantial. Like, there's no way to really do it as big as it happens in the books, because you only get a limited description. You're not constantly seeing like the face of this person and their build and stuff like that. I mean, this is a small framed child, but I really don't think anyone was convinced it was a boy. And Rudius just seems like he's just the densest idiot of all time, continuing to think this is just a boy, especially because he goes in lengths, even in the light novel, of talking about, oh, he's so beautiful, he's so attractive, like maybe I should be friends with this boy because he's going to get all the ladies and I could just, pick up leftovers or whatever. This is going to be a great relationship, yada, yada, yada. So he takes Sylph and he cleans her up. I'm going to refer to her as a girl, and uses different magics to do that, water and then heat, and heats the water up and, basically washes all this stuff off. And then they find out, that Sylph is going to deliver food to her father, who works at the watchtower, and Rudius and Sylph go off to see the father and deliver the lunch. And then you also find out, that father knows Paul, because Paul is, a nobleman, and he's, working watchtowers and saving their safety. So they're kind of the same, similar jobs, and they know each other. So after they deliver the father food, they have a little bit of spare time and they go to hang out. And that's where Rudius starts to work with Sylph and teach Sylph how to use some really, really basic magic, because Sylph is super interested in it. And it seems like Sylph has a pretty good affinity with it and starts picking up the basics and asking, the good questions that they should be asking and stuff. And so that goes on until it gets, a little later in the day. And then Rudius, he makes his way home. Well, when he gets home, he faces Paul. And Paul is livid. He is just going off the handles right away, just all stop, no breaks, yelling at Rudius, being like, I can't believe you've done this. I thought I taught you better than this. This is insane. And Rudius has no idea what's going on. And then his father explains, I had to talk to this woman from town, and her son was beaten up. He had a black eye. You obviously kicked the crap out of him, and I'm furious with you. How dare you go out and you hurt somebody like that? And he's just screaming and screaming and screaming, having no idea what this situation is. And this is where things also get really weird, because again, you have to think about Rudius's age at the time. he starts kind of talking back to his dad, chastising him. He makes these really wild comments like, oh, well, I guess, when I go out in town and I see some boys beating someone up, I'll just join them. And I'll say, you know what? I'm a gray rat. And that's what the gray rat family does. We just beat people down. And his father's like, wait, what? And he realizes he hasn't even listened to his son. He just got this word from some lady, and he just flew right off the handles and went just straight at his son about it. And he really starts to feel kind of a way about it. Rudius explains the situation to him, and it's just kind of a really super huge moment, especially as a person, like I said before, who has raised a child. When you've raised a child, these are the moments that you have. Like parenting, especially when you're doing it for the first time, does not come easy. And again, Paul is just a 25-year-old man that just had this thrust on him. You actually find that out a little bit more later. And, he makes this huge mistake and feels terrible about being this way with his son. What I really liked about this chapter, though, is at this point, it does switch perspective to Paul's situation and how he experienced this. And so you have Paul just kind of hanging out, and then this lady comes storming up to him, and she's like, this is what your son's done, and shows the kid with the black eye. And Paul feels a certain way about his son. Like, he feels that his son is incredibly talented, that he is very powerful, and that, in some ways, if his son does not control his actions, he is very dangerous. There is a definite power balance between who Rudius is as a child and who other children are. And it kind of puts like a fear in him that he's not doing enough for his child. He's not raising his child right. He's not teaching him right. And he feels like he had taught him right. And then for this event to happen, it puts him into kind of a shock, which again, as a parent, is something that everyone experiences at some point. Like it is just, you think that you've taught them something, and then you see them not applying these things. And so what Paul does, he's this strong, cocksure 25-year-old man. He puts it in his head, like, I need to teach Rudius this. Rudius needs to know what he needs to be doing in these situations, and I am not to falter because this is for the betterment of my child. And he makes this whole plan up in his head. And so when Rudius comes home, he just piles right into him, and he just gets so angry and so mad, and he says these things only to find out he is completely wrong, and his son should not have been yelled at, but his son should have been praised for stepping up to enemies and bullies and stopping them and protecting someone who is weaker and in a poor position. And he's just kind of left with this massive failing as a parent that's just soul-wrenching and crushing to him. And Paul looks back and he thinks about how things were with his father and how his father treated him and how he felt. And he remembers that when he was younger, he ran away from home at a very young age. He just set out on his own because he wasn't going to deal with his father and his cruel ways and stuff like that. And he does not want this. He never intended for this, nor did he ever want this. And that sits very, very deeply with him. And it was just a really powerful chapter. I mean, the first time I read this and saw this from like Paul's perspective, it was so easy to put myself in those shoes. Now, in this particular situation, when Rudius talked back to Paul, Paul hit him. I've never hit my child, so I can't say I've done that, but I've been very, very angry before. And I've felt very upset, and then I've also felt like I've made a mistake and felt terrible about it. And to read this in a narrative, it was done so well. It really was just so realistic, and it was so powerful. I really, this chapter just resonated in my soul deeply. It was absolutely crazy. But ultimately, in the end, he is happy that Rudius did make a good decision, and he just has to do what he has to do and move forward with it.
What flashed before my eyes in that moment was not the pure short sword I've grown accustomed to.
So chapter 8 is where Rudius becomes 6 years old. And with that, he starts combining his magic and his techniques and his swordplay, which is where he really starts to get unconventional with all of his fighting. And that's one thing that kind of makes him truly powerful in this world, is how he takes information from his past life and then applies it into his new life with these new things. And it truly makes him god tier above other stuff. I have suspicion that Rudius has some kind of innate powers that he's gained, but I don't even know if that's really true. I haven't even got to that part in the anime. He could just be really good at learning and having started over from scratch and having this knowledge head start. That could be what it is. But his unconventional thinking is definitely a very, very massive thing for him. Rudius continues teaching Sylphiette magic and stuff, and they progress with that training. And he also learns about how magic, people have affinities and things that are harder for them to do, and that those are based off like past experiences. So for one, Sylphiette isn't super great with fire magic, and he learns that she doesn't feel like she's afraid of fire, but when she was 3, she got a really horrible burn. And stuff like that really affects how you learn magic one way or the other. And I just found like that a really interesting little tidbit into this lore of this bigger system with magics and combat and everything. Okay, so the big one I felt like was done also super, super good in the anime, but while they're training one day, it starts to just have this massive downpour on everyone. And Rudius and Sylphiette get very soaking wet. And they rush back to Rudius's house because they got to take off their clothes, get out of their cold stuff, and get into a nice hot bath so they don't catch a cold and get sick. So the two go upstairs, and Lilia sets a nice warm bath for them, and they're getting ready for it. And Rudius takes off all his clothes, and then he looks at Sylph, and he's like, why aren't you taking your pants off? Like, you got to take your pants off. You can't keep your pants on. And Sylph is just like, I am not taking my pants off because she's a girl, right? But Rudius doesn't seem to know that. And he's like, oh, come on, you got to do it. And he's pushing at her, and he's kind of driving at it. And she is just more and more and more uncomfortable with this situation, as she should be. And eventually, Rudius gets to a point where he's like, all right, I won't do it. And then he's like, hey, I'm gonna do it. And he grabs her panties and yanks them straight down. And holy crap, not what he was expecting. He is floored. And then, typical anime fashion, Paul just walks in and basically sees what he's perceiving as his son assaulting a little girl, which is horrible. So kind of hilariously, it switches to Paul's perspective, and Paul is ashamed and upset with his child. He's like, what are you doing? I told you to treat girls better than this. And he goes off on all this stuff on Rudius and how he can't be doing this, and this is not right, and what the heck, kid? And, he's mad, and he's trying to teach his kid the right way and stuff. But it's also kind of obvious that Paul doesn't realize that Rudius thought Sylph was a boy. And so he's approaching it like, this boy, you can't tease girls like that. Like he's flirting with her or something, right? But like mean flirting, as kids do. And he treats him like that, and he tells, you got to apologize to her. That is what you must do. You cannot not apologize to her. And he sets him off to apologize to Sylphiette. Well, Rudius apologizes and literally says, you had short hair, so I thought you were a boy. which is not the right thing to say, obviously. But on top of that, Paul realizes his son's an idiot. Like it's just an interesting thing, because up until this point, you keep thinking about how Paul feels like his son almost feels like he's above him, like he's so smart. He's like, I don't know, ascending what normal children would be. And the reality is that Rudius, and again, to our knowledge, even despite living for 40 years, he's pretty dense with things. He's pretty freaking dense, and his real life experience is pretty much nothing. And it just leads to this really, really ridiculous situation. And I can't believe I did the same thing when I was reading it in the visual novels I did when I was watching the anime. It's like you cringe so hard. Like it's like a whole body cringe. Like, oh no, like what are you doing? It's just awful. You don't want it to happen, but there it is. It happens. Anyway, after that, obviously, the relationship between Rudius and Sylph is pretty far thrown off. I think that Rudius feels a really horrible way about himself. He's ashamed. He's guilty. He just feels so wrong and so dirty. And so even though he still wants to be friends with Sylph, he kind of doesn't know exactly how to do that right. He doesn't know how to emotionally manage that and push forward. I mean, this has been a really weak point of him throughout his entire life. And so he talks to Paul, and Paul kind of gives him some advice on what he needs to do, and that he needs to kind of open up to Sylph. He needs to show his weak side. And he eventually ends up meeting with Sylph, and they have this really good discussion. And she's like, Rudius, you've been off, you've been weird, you've been treating me cold lately. I don't know what to do. I'm uncomfortable as well. And, that's when Rudius talks about just how terrible he feels and his shame and his guilt. And because of that, their friendship is able to kind of come back together and get back to a place where they can move forward and be good friends.
Naturally, she and Paul were overjoyed at the news.
Well, yes.
My humble apologies. I'm afraid I'm pregnant.
So I feel like at this point, the story has just rapidly gone forward. And the next chapter is called Emergency Family Meeting, which is freaking huge. First off, we find out that Zenith is pregnant with another child. But then, while the family is celebrating and reveling in that, another announcement is made about a month later. Lilia's also pregnant. And guess what? It's also Paul's child. So Paul got Lilia pregnant right after he got Zenith pregnant, which is just dog 101, I guess. I don't know. It's kind of no surprise from Paul at that point, because he is just kind of a horn dog like that. But it's pretty wild. And so because of that, they have to have this really big family meeting where they all meet together and they talk about what they're going to do. Zenith is furious. She is absolutely furious. She couldn't be more furious, as you would imagine. And Lilia is like distraught. She's crushed. It's like, this was a terrible thing she's done. She's done some bad stuff, right? But Paul is the evilest one. He's the dog in the situation. And shame on him for seducing the maid. How dare he? And it's just this big raucous meeting that's had, just tons of emotion, a lot of feelings all around on everything. And Rudius starts to feel like his parents might end up separated. And he starts getting really worried about that. Unfortunately, it seems like he's mostly worried about it because of his own intentions, like his own what will happen to him personally. He's thinking about it relatively selfishly. Like, he doesn't really even seem to care about his mother and his father and their feelings and Lilia's feelings, but he does care about keeping everything together. And so he kind of makes up this stupid story and says all this yippity yap crap to try to save Lilia in a way and keep her in the family, keep everyone together, keep Mother from leaving. And shockingly, it kind of works. And they end up deciding that they're just going to extend the family. We're going to have 2 moms with 3 babies, 2 babies and Rudius, and that's where they're going to move forward. After it's decided, they actually cut off to Lilia's perspective, and I found this to be pretty interesting. First, you learn a little bit of a backstory of Paul and Lilia when they were younger. And when they had met together, Paul had pined after Lilia and snuck into her room at one night and forcibly had sex with her, which is kind of crazy. But Lilia's response to that is also interesting because she doesn't exactly describe it as a horrific event. just that she wasn't in love with Paul, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but there's a lot of that stuff with the female characters in this series that goes forward. It's definitely a different world where women feel much differently about things. It kind of reminds me of like 1950s ideology where, you know, the women, I guess, were just to roll with whatever was going on. I don't really fully understand that because that's way outside my era. But in this universe, this also kind of seems to be the same thing. Like, oh, yeah, that's just what's happening to me, and it is what it is. However, Lilia also goes to explain that there was some much grosser, worse people that did much grosser and worse things to her. And so she kind of looks back at what was going on with her and Paul with a little bit of fondness, which again is a whole psychological story in itself to delve into. Yeah, that's kind of what happened there. And so later in life, it turns out she seeked out working for Paul, knowing that they had that history, because she was going to use that as leverage to have her situation be more advantageous. She knew she could use that, which in itself isn't entirely a really super good thing to do. I would argue that that is also kind of gross behavior to do. Then when she gets into the household, she kind of finds Paul to be very appealing to her, and she's kind of pining for him, but she thinks she can hold back on that a bit. She does for quite a while, but when Zenith gets pregnant and Paul gets a little extra handsy, she decides that she is going to invite Paul to her room. So she was the aggressor. Paul was not being a great guy, but he wasn't trying to break into her room. She was the one that set that up on her own for her own selfish reasons of lust, which is something that I think is huge in this entire story and what makes it so good. There is a lot of nuance and there is a lot of gray areas. Not everything is as black and white and as clear as it could be. Everyone kind of has their own thing, just as humans do. And it is just actually a really powerful part of this whole story. So along with that, you also get to listen to Lilia describe her feelings on Rudius, how when she first came into the family, he seemed really gross and creepy, and she wasn't sure about him. She didn't think he was worthy of respect. However, with him saving her and her baby and being able to keep her in this comfortable position, she now feels like she has kind of like a life debt to Rudius. And that comes into play much later. I mean, that's actually like a huge thing that has ramifications throughout this whole story. So the chapter concludes with Rudius teaching Sylphiette up to intermediate level skills, which is really cool. She becomes pretty good at magic, really, by all accounts. And along with that, Lilia starts opening up a lot more to Rudius and telling him all sorts of stories about Paul and her and when they were younger. And basically, as she continues to tell him these stories, Rudius's resentment and hatred for his father grows massively. And he just sees his father as a disgusting rapist and a cheater by the time it's all done, which is a pretty horrible way to view your father, though maybe not inaccurate. And finally, at the very end of the chapter, the two new daughters are born.
According to my parents, I've been weird since I was born.
That's not what I mean. You look sad about something.
I've been kinda stuck lately.
Chapter 10 is a little bit of a come down from all the excitement of the last couple chapters. However, it is also a very important one. At this point, Rudius is 7 years old and his siblings are growing up a little bit. Rudius is kind of observing his parents and how they're raising them and looking down on him a lot, actually. It's kind of interesting how Rudius kind of builds to be bitter. It is implied a little bit as the story goes, and you do find out from the parents' perspectives that they do feel like Rudius is like this. But it's really, really apparent in this particular episode. He seems to be chastising them and doesn't seem to understand why, if they've raised a child already, why are they doing such a terrible job at raising these new children? He's so dense, though. Like, he doesn't completely understand that the reason why his parents are struggling is because he wasn't really a baby when they raised him. Like, he didn't act like a baby. He wasn't like a baby, all the normal baby stuff. This is literally basically their first experience actually raising children. And they suck at it because they're young people and they don't know what to do. And their last child was just so damn easy. Everything was simple and abnormal. They didn't understand that. You would also think that the parents kind of get a little bit more of a perspective on how abnormal that Rudius was, but that doesn't even get brought up at all, which I thought was just kind of strange. There's kind of a lot of this behind the curtain stuff, I think, that they just kind of hand wave away. So with that, he is feeling very bitter about his parents, and Paul in particular at this point. He is just kind of fully immersed in his dislike for him. And because of that, he tries to think of all the positives of Paul, whatever he can think of about him. And it kind of just boils down to how great Paul is with the sword and the great things he's done as like a nobleman, I guess, and his prowess, and that how he's very happy that Paul is teaching him how to use the sword because he is very proficient with that. But that's kind of where the buck ends, and he does very firmly land that he just doesn't like his father at all, which, as the story goes on, is very ironic. So then the story kind of goes into this thing where Paul's training him the swords, and he doesn't feel like he's progressing with swords, and he talks with Paul about like adventuring and improving his skills and all this stuff, and he starts to think, honestly, I should probably go to the University of Magic that Roxy talked about, and I should learn all this cool magic stuff and become better that way because I'm stagnating right now. Paul's not really super interested in that, especially because his son is so young. Then he goes and he hangs out with Sylph, and they train her some more, and they go through all this different training. And Rudius again is like, what have I done? I don't really think I've improved at all. I think I'm just sitting here, just, not progressing after doing all this massive progress. And then there's kind of like a nail in the coffin, and Roxy sends him a letter, and she talks about how she's gone off and she's now taking care of this king who's a handsy little asshole and teaching him magic, and she's doing all this improvement herself. She's becoming incredible at what she's done. She's ascended to new levels, and she mentions in it, oh, well, I bet you're just so much more impressive than me, though, because you're so talented and amazing, and I can't even imagine what level you're at right now, to where Rudius looks at himself pretty deeply and is like, I've done nothing, which is a sentiment I can kind of vibe with pretty hard. And yeah, there's a lot of soul searching in that level, and he is just kind of in a really rough place right now. So while he's hanging out with Sylphie, he mentions to her that he thinks he should go to the University of Magic, and she just loses it. She absolutely loses it. And I think it's for the first time that Rudius really realizes how codependent Sylphiette is to him. Like, she doesn't seem like she can do anything without him. She is completely attached to him, completely absorbed with him teaching her, protecting her, all this stuff. She's not really becoming her own self. And Rudius is like, his response to that basically is, well, then we'll go to university together. I'll make sure that happens. So with that, Rudius sets out to go talk to Paul and see if he'll pay for tuition for both him and Sylph. No is the answer. He says, Rudius, you need to do some more work with your swordsmanship and work your butt off, which honestly is pretty freaking fair considering he's like 7 years old. Why would his father let him go off to college? But there's a little bit, that we talked about with the dad kind of feeling away about when he was a kid, now he ran away. But at the same time, this is wrong. This is all wrong. And even Paul, with his stupidity and absolute young naivety, he knows you can't do this. And he's also seen, other people in a situation, and he worries for Sylph. Sylph is a small little girl, and she is completely dependent on Rudius. Without Rudius, she's probably not going to last very long. And Rudius is a horn dog, so he's probably not going to keep her very long. Paul doesn't know. These are unknown variables to him. And so has this fear that she'll follow him around all over the world and, he'll protect her and save her and she'll be super dependent. And then one day he'll stray and leave her totally all on her lonesome and she'll have nothing and she'll be destitute and life will be horrible and miserable. And I think that's actually incredibly fair of Paul. This is actually the most based moment of Paul's entire existence, probably at this point. So when he says no, Rudius, as he is, he's stubborn, he's set on his ways. Rudius decides that he's going to ask his dad to just help him find a job anyway. And his dad is like, why would my son be asking this? Son, why? And he goes, because I'm going to save up for tuition for Sylph. And then his father's sitting there like, okay, so I'm telling my kid no, and he's just finding a way around this so that what he wants still happens. I can't do this. I have to figure out something. And the final bit of the chapter is literally just from Paul's perspective, literally speaking about this. He talks about how, when he was a kid, he pined to run away and all this stuff. And he also talks about how he's seen the thing going on with Sylph and Rudius and how that can play out in the worst ways possible. And, his head's swirling and he's just really very committed to this. He is not going to let his son do this. He doesn't care how smart or talented his son is. It's not going to happen one way or the other.
That's water god style. At least it's a wooden sword.
So the next chapter starts off with Rudius and Paul in the morning the next day. And Paul is like, hey, Rudius, I have a question for you. How would you feel if, you didn't see Sylph for a while? What if I asked you to stop seeing her for a bit? How would you feel about that? And Rudius goes, yeah, well, I'd object. And his father's like, okay, and attacks him. It's actually a really wild fight. Rudius is kind of amazing, and he is able to kind of counter his father, even though he's like really overall overmatched, but outmatched. And so he's dodging and he's using his magic and he's fighting with his sword as best as he can, trying to dodge. And he's kind of keeping up with Paul, frills at the beginning here. But that doesn't last very long. And eventually Paul is just like, I'm putting the kibosh to this. It's over. And just whop, just knocks Rudius flat out. He's done for. Game over. Sorry, Rudius. So then we get to see, Rudius waking up and he's in what was in the narrative described really odd. It's like a wooden box. So I guess the description was meant to tell us that Rudius was literally so confused he couldn't really figure out what it could be. It makes actually quite a bit of sense because whoever rides in a wooden carriage in modern times, nobody. So it would be weird. But he's in this wooden carriage and across from him is just a fucking giant tittied beast woman wearing pretty much nothing. Like imagine little surgical masks over the nip-nips. That's Ghislaine. And he meets her for the first time. She's intimidating. She is a literal sword king. And she also knows and has slept with Paul, which we find out very shortly because Rudius finds a letter from his dad. And the letter basically says everything that needed to be said. And I was actually kind of shocked because Rudius is so obstinate throughout this, and he sees himself as above his dad. He doesn't really seem to think much of his dad. And the former chapters leading up to this moment really just, he's talking a lot of crap about his dad. But when he's done reading the letter, he actually has to give Paul a little bit of props here because he's making a lot of sense. As much as Rudius doesn't really like the idea, and this wasn't his plan at all, Paul is speaking plain. He's putting it down. And the plan that he set in motion is going to force his hand to doing what his dad wants. So ultimately, what his dad tells him is, you're going to go in this carriage with this Sword King, and you're going to go off to another town. And I got a second cousin, and he has someone in his castle who is nuts. Literally like a small child, but basically a ferocious, untamed animal. She won't listen to anything, but her dad really, really needs her to learn some stuff. She's got to learn some magic. She's got to learn some reading. She's got to learn some writing. She's got some other stuff she does too. The only thing she cares about is sword fighting. And so it's Rudius's job over the next 5 years to help this crazy person out, teach them the things that they need to learn per their father's wish. And if he can do that, he will earn 2 passes, basically 2 payments to pay for tuition at the Magic University, which fulfills what Rudius ultimately desires to do. And it also separates the two for a bit so that Sylph can learn to stand on her feet for a while. And really, it's a pretty darn good plan. Like, he's giving Rudius a very actionable thing to do, and his reward will be basically what he wants. But Paul's really clever too, and he's not so sure that after those 5 years, he's going to really think the same way about Sylph. I mean, if you think he's 7 already, 5, most of his life ahead of him, it's going to take to do this task. And so he just generically says 2 people can go, meaning, you know, if he falls in love with this person he's supposed to be tutoring, or if he finds another lady in the city, he gets to go with them too, and he can do that if he wishes to. It's actually a pretty great plan. I actually thought it was pretty smart. In some ways, I don't know that the writing is incredibly realistic in that part because Paul's kind of an idiot, but I don't know. It's very interesting. It's interesting depth to Paul, and the idea is solid and good. And Rudius is like, all right, on top of that, the giant big-titted beast woman, he's also got to teach her some things too. She's got to learn how to read, and she's got to learn how to write. I think she's got to learn how to do math too. I think that's part of it. And that's part of the whole deal. And so Rudius just looks at himself and he's like, what else am I going to do? What else is going to happen? I don't know. I have no idea. I can't fight this. And so he just decides he's going to go along with it. So this chapter is the final chapter outside of the extra chapter of the book. So the final part of the story. And I think it's a really great ending. And they end the particular chapter itself with just a little bit of thoughts from Paul's perspective. He's thinking about how he was actually kind of impressed with his son and his fighting skills. And he thinks his son is going to do quite all right out there. He also kind of sees this task he put in front of his child to be kind of rough parenting, but he ultimately recognizes that it really is the right thing to do. And I fully agree with that sentiment entirely, even knowing what the future events are. But even if you didn't know that, I actually think this is very clever and very smart of him. It talks a little bit about, you know, how the mothers, Zenith and Lilia, are sad about it, and Sylph also sees that Rudius was knocked out when they drag him into the carriage and everything, and just everyone's kind of stressed for that. It's really weird because Sylph is like, oh, I'm gonna save him, which kind of makes it sound like he's being kidnapped, but I guess it just shows how oblivious she is to what's actually happening. Her father talks to her and everything seems to be okay from that point forward. And then the mothers, you know, while they're sad and bummed out, I think they kind of also just accept Paul's decision. I think they accept Paul's decision well enough. And what else are they going to do? They got new babies to raise. So this last chapter is technically not, you know, part of the main story. They call it an extra chapter, and it's called The Mother of the Gray Rat Family. Now, this chapter is really cool, and it sets something in place that continues throughout the rest of the light novels. They always kind of end with an extra chapter, and I just thought this one in particular was an absolutely phenomenal way to wrap up this book. Because Rudius getting knocked out is really cool from like a story perspective, but it doesn't really give you like this kind of cohesive, it's more like a to be continued than like a warm hug at the end of a story being told. And so this chapter literally goes through Zenith's feelings about a number of events. And it starts off where she's reminiscing while she is taking care of these babies, and Rudius is there with her. It's incredibly heartwarming. There's a little bit of our standard moosh perviness where the mom's breastfeeding and Rudius is trying to tell her to breastfeed you know, her child, and then Lilia's not back yet. And so Rudius also wants the other child to be breastfed by Zenith. And that it's actually really interesting. Remove the perviness aside, the story that's being told with this is actually really, really interesting because it's a narrative device they're using to show character development with Zenith and kind of how she's coping with this entire scenario. She makes kind of this really big deal about, like, should I breastfeed this child? Like, what if, I am disgusted? What if I, feel away? And what if I like visually portray these negative emotions about this child and Rudius sees that? How will that affect Rudius? And I think that those things in itself really tell a lot about Zenith and who she is and how she thinks about stuff, which is really great because I feel like she's a character that isn't really deeply examined throughout this first book. And honestly, I think in anything I'm aware of it, period. And so it's just really interesting to hear from her perspective. And she just talks about how she feels like Rudius felt above them and negative towards them. And she wasn't really sure if she even really felt like his child, which is a lot more astute than you would think she would be about the situation. And then it kind of ends into this scenario where Rudius is sitting down next to her and she's rubbing his head and she's just feeling like everything is okay. And she does end up breastfeeding the child of Lilia and Paul, and also kind of just realizes that, I overthought this. This is much more simple than I've made it out to be. And again, I think there's a lot of things that more modern audiences might have kind of problems with, like that level of thinking and that turn of events. But in this world, I think that it makes a lot of sense and it's telling a very good story with very good character development throughout. You really get a good, strong idea of who Zenith was, despite not really having a lot of deep insight into her thoughts and feelings and who she is and where she fits in with this whole world throughout the rest of the light novel. What this chapter also does really well is it talks about the backstory of Zenith and like kind of where she came from and stuff. She was originally not from a place that you would think for a person that would meet Paul. She was actually a very devout believer in religion for the Church of the Milius, which becomes a much bigger factor later. But for this point, you just really need to know that they're very based off of their vows. Their word is the best thing that they have for them. They're very moral people. And on top of that, they also have just very singular relationships, just two partners in the relationship. And commitment means something true and deep to them. Well, she's raised in this, affluent family, and she studies hard, she works hard, she builds up her skills with the healing magic through the church. She just seems to be, the kind of child that just agrees with everything and goes along with everything and tries her best to be a great person until her 15th birthday. And this chapter doesn't really talk about it, but she got into this big fight with her parents and she ends up running away. Part of that is inspired by her sister, who I guess was a little bit rebellious when they were growing up, and she was always kind of jealous of her. But she decides she's going to run away at 15. And Zenith says, I have this magic, and it's healing magic, and hospitals everywhere would love me. She's just very naive. It's just a very big story of a naive girl that gets mad at parents, feels like she can do everything by herself on her own and be successful. And she sets out. She's like, I'm going to make my own life. I'm going to be a strong, independent, magic healing woman working at the hospitals or whatever. Well, she sets out and immediately finds out how naive she is. She joins a group of adventurers, and they are described as being not good people. They're very bad. And at a certain point, she thinks she's going to get very used and abused by this group of people who she describes as being a group of dishonest people. That includes, her fear of being raped by them, which, I'm sure as this young child setting out on her own is pretty freaking fearful of that. But this is where Paul comes in. Paul somehow, and again, they don't spell the whole scenario out here, but Paul rescues her from that, and he takes her in, and he takes her away from them, and they join together to be in Paul's party at this point as the healer. And Paul isn't necessarily the best guy. She doesn't describe Paul as being incredible or amazing. In fact, she kind of feels like they're opposites. He lies, he cheats, he steals, his word is good for nothing. He's constantly banging every chick that even wafts in the air around him. And he's just kind of a rude and crude, brash guy like that. He's like, I don't know, it almost sounds like he's like a kind of a Han Solo kind of a guy, really. She just, is not enthused with him, but she also doesn't see him as a bad guy. She thinks ultimately he's not a bad guy at all. They end up, spending time and adventuring and doing things together, but what she kind of really focuses on mentioning is he's very handsy with her. He's always trying to grab her butt. He's always trying to make moves on her, and he is constantly pressuring her to sleep with him. He's just basically begging all the time, please, 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 please. Zenith doesn't know why, but she decides that she's going to give in one day. And but with a caveat. She says, listen here, I'll tell you what, if you never sleep with anyone ever again, other than me, I will have sex with you. Paul is like, bet. A wink and a nod there. Zenith knows ultimately that this is going to be a failure for Paul, but she's going to see what happens and give him the opportunity, I guess. And they sleep together. Shockingly, Rudius is conceived that night. That is how Zenith ends up pregnant, is the one first time that they ever slept together. Even more surprising to Zenith is that Paul also does the right thing. He decides to marry her. And they end up getting married and, having a little house out in the countryside and everything. And that's kind of where the story started from a perspective that we had no idea about. And I just loved it. I loved it. And those kind of meaningful twists and stuff are kind of what the extra chapters seem to be made of. I've only read this one and the next one, and I'm very excited to talk about the next one. Ultimately, this chapter was a fantastic way to wrap up this book when it's part of a much bigger series. There's 26 books in total. Now, overall, I want to talk about my final thoughts of it, and just kind of in brief, because this video has been very long and I've given a lot of my thoughts throughout all of it. But first off, I want to say, if you like this video, please let me know. And if you do not like this video, please let me know, because I'm going to use how this video is received and how it performs to determine whether or not I continue with this series in this extremely long format. I don't mind doing them. I had a lot of fun filming this. I had a bunch of issues and it took me a while, but I had a lot of fun with this. I just want to know, is it something that has any value to anyone, or should I just be doing what a lot of people do and doing these very short, reviews where I just kind of talk about the basics of everything and then move forward from there? Overall, I really like the book. I was kind of a little bit shocked in the way that when I made my video on the anime, I had a lot of people who thought that my feelings about it might change with the books, because they feel like the books are a lot darker and sicker and twisted, and it doesn't cover up the nasty parts of the story. And I actually fully disagree with that. I think that the anime did a really good job at portraying what, especially this first book, has in it, and that my opinion didn't change whatsoever. If anything, all this did was reinforce my love for this show that I've just loved for so long now and just really been impressed and amazed with. It's really cool to read the words. I feel like a lot of it is very, very, very similar. There is a little bit of extra depth to it, but I think the emotional impact is even deeper when you're reading the words and seeing this play out through text. It's been very, very fun. I've been using this at night to go to bed. So a couple hours or an hour before I go to bed, I start reading, and it's been really good. I've been enjoying it, and I don't have any qualms with this. In fact, I have no qualms with this story, period. I, feel like a lot of the sentiment that people have comes from immaturity, and this is just very, very good story writing. I do not believe that all characters need to be perfect and squeaky clean. They do not need to be beloved in every way. I myself work in a prison and deal with people who are incarcerated every day. And I can tell you that there are some really, really nasty, horrible people out there who try to make changes for the better and improve themselves. And that path never is a clean, squeaky, beautiful story to be told, make a movie about, all this stuff. There is ups and downs. And in fact, I would argue even beyond that, if you've ever met anyone who's had addiction to anything in their life, you'll also see that is true. Most people's paths, the majority, the bulk, I don't know the exact statistics, but through and through, you will see people doing great things that uplift them and make them better, and things that plummet them down, maybe even lower than what they had before, but they will continue to grow through that. And sometimes their growth doesn't lead them to be perfect people at the end of it. I mean, oftentimes that's true of life. And I think that it's true in this story. And quite honestly, I applaud this story for doing that and pushing that and being okay with having a character who is not perfect and is not someone that you're always rooting for. I do not think that's a problem. I do not think that's even anything close to a problem. I think if anything, it just speaks volumes about how great this is. And you just need to frame yourself with some maturity when thinking about this story and this character development, because it's incredible. It's probably one of the best animes I have ever experienced in my life, and reading this visual novel has been absolutely a treat through and through. I can't wait to eat them all up and read all the books and see where this goes, because I know it's a crazy roller coaster. I've had just tiny little spoilers. I ask in the comments below you do not give me spoilers. Please do not do that, but feel free to have a discussion amongst yourselves. The last video was quite entertaining, seeing people's back and forths with each other. A lot of people think differently about this, and I welcome you to do that below. Just try to be as respectful as you can with each other. Know that people have different backgrounds, different thoughts, and different feelings. But ultimately know where I stand on this. And I am a very strong supporter of this storytelling. And I think that this author really did something that's incredible. With that, if you guys like this content, hit the thumbs up. If you don't, hit the thumbs down, and subscribe to Yokes Otaku for more anime news, reviews, and gaming. And whatever the future of this series looks like, I will continue with it. Right after this is done, I am probably going to start working on the second light novel, which I finished, and I'm about halfway through the third light novel reading it, and then that video will come up shortly after that too. So let me know your thoughts below, and I appreciate you. Thank you so much for hanging in on this incredibly long video, and stay tuned. There are some outtakes at the end, which are totally bananas and content you never see from me, so enjoy. Mushoku Tensei is an absolutely fantastic anime. One of my favorite of all time, in fact. And I know that you all think Rudius is a fucking pedophile, but guess what? You're a fucking immature idiot who doesn't understand proper storyline, because Mushoku Tensei is art. So then Rudius heads off to tell his dad, yo, will you pay for college for me and for Sylph to go to college, yo? Frills, no cap, 100. And his dad looks at him and he goes, Rudius, go fuck yourself. And so Rudius does. Rudius goes and fucks himself. And together they do nothing. And Rudius hates his dad and resents him forever. And the story ends as he is miserably in his house where he doesn't learn or grow at all. And that's the tale of Mushoku Tensei in its entirety.